Chapter 55 of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 55 of Family Matters, Cares, Hopes, Disappointments, and Sorrows. Although Mrs. Nickleby had been made acquainted by her son and daughter with every circumstance of Madeline Bray's history which was known to them, although the responsible situation in which Nicholas stood had been carefully explained to her, and she had been prepared even for the possible contingency of having to receive the young lady in her own house, improbable as such a result had appeared only a few minutes before it came about, still Mrs. Nickleby, from the moment when this confidence was first reposed in her, late on the previous evening, had remained in an unsatisfactory and profoundly mystified state, from which no explanations or arguments could relieve her, and which every fresh soliloquy and reflection only aggravated more and more. "Bless my heart, Kate," so the good lady argued, "if the Mr. Cheerybles don't want this young lady to be married, why don't they file a bill against the Lord Chancellor, make her a Chancery ward, and shut her up in the Fleet Prison for safety? I have read of such things in the newspapers 100 times. Or, if they are so very fond of her as Nicholas says they are, why don't they marry her themselves? One of them, I mean. And even supposing they don't want her to be married, and don't want to marry her themselves, why, in the name of wonder, should Nicholas go about the world forbidding people's banns?" "I don't think you quite understand," said Kate, gently. "Well, I am sure, Kate, my dear, you're very polite," replied Mrs. Nickleby. "I have been married myself, I hope, and I have seen other people married. Not understand, indeed!" "I know you have had great experience, dear mama," said Kate. "I mean that perhaps you don't quite understand all the circumstances in this instance. We have stated them awkwardly, I dare say." "That I dare say you have," retorted her mother, briskly. "That's very likely. I am not to be held accountable for that, though, at the same time, as the circumstances speak for themselves, I shall take the liberty, my love, of saying that I do understand them, and perfectly well too, whatever you and Nicholas may choose to think to the contrary. Why is such a great fuss made because this Miss Magdalen is going to marry somebody who is older than herself? Your poor papa was older than I was, 4 years and a half older. Jane the de Babses lived in the beautiful little thatched white house, 1 story high, covered all over with ivy and creeping plants, with an exquisite little porch with twining honeysuckles and all sorts of things, where the earwigs used to fall into one's tea on a summer evening, and always fell upon their backs and kicked dreadfully, and where the frogs used to get into the rushlight shades when one stopped all night, and sit up and look through the little holes like Christians. Jane de Babs, she married a man who was a great deal older than herself, and would marry him, notwithstanding all that could be said to the contrary, and she was so fond of him that nothing was ever equal to it. There was no fuss made about Jane de Babs, and her husband was a most honourable and excellent man, and everybody spoke well of him. Then why should there be any fuss about this Magdalen?" "Her husband is much older. He is not her own choice. His character is the very reverse of that which you have just described. Don't you see a broad distinction between the two cases?" said Kate. To this Mrs. Nickleby only replied that she durst say she was very stupid. Indeed, she had no doubt she was, for her own children almost as much as told her so every day of her life. To be sure, she was a little older than they, and perhaps some foolish people might think she ought to reasonably know best. However, no doubt she was wrong. Of course she was. She always was. She couldn't be right, she couldn't be expected to be, so she had better not expose herself any more. And to all Kate's conciliations and concessions for an hour ensuing, the good lady gave no other replies than, "Oh, certainly, why did they ask her? Her opinion was of no consequence. It didn't matter what she said," with many other rejoinders of the same class. In this frame of mind, expressed when she had become too resigned for speech by nods of the head, upliftings of the eyes, and little beginnings of groans, converted as they attracted attention into short coughs, Mrs. Nickleby remained until Nicholas and Kate returned with the object of their solicitude, when, having by this time asserted her own importance, and becoming besides interested in the trials of one so young and beautiful, she not only displayed the utmost zeal and solicitude, but took great credit to herself for recommending the course of procedure which her son had adopted, frequently declaring, with an expressive look, that it was very fortunate things were as they were, and hinting that but for great encouragement and wisdom on her own part, they never could have been brought to that pass. Not to strain the question whether Mrs. Nickleby had or had not any great hand in bringing matters about, it is unquestionable that she had strong ground for exultation. The brothers, on their return, bestowed such commendations on Nicholas for the part he had taken, and evinced so much joy at the altered state of events and the recovery of their young friend from trials so great and dangers so threatening, that as she more than once informed her daughter, she now considered the fortunes of the family as good as made. Mr. Charles Cheeryble, indeed, Mrs. Nickleby positively asserted, had, in the first transports of his surprise and delight, as good as said so. Without precisely explaining what this qualification meant, she subsided, whenever she mentioned the subject, into such a mysterious and important state, and had such visions of health and dignity in perspective, that, vague and clouded though they were, she was at such times almost as happy as if she had really been permanently provided for, on a scale of great splendour. The sudden and terrible shock she had received, combined with the great affliction and anxiety of mind which she had for a long time endured, proved too much for Madeline's strength. Recovering from the state of stupefaction into which the sudden death of her father happily plunged her, she was only exchanged that condition for one of dangerous and active illness. When the delicate physical powers which have been sustained by an unnatural strain upon the mental energies and a resolute determination not to yield at last give way, their degree of prostration is usually proportionate to the strength of the effort which has previously upheld them. Thus it was that the illness which fell on Madeline was of no slight or temporary nature, but one which, for a time, threatened her reason, and, scarcely worse, her life itself. Who, slowly recovering from a disorder so severe and dangerous, could be insensible to the unremitting attentions of such a nurse as gentle, tender, earnest Kate? On whom could the sweet soft voice, the light step, the delicate hand, the quiet, cheerful, noiseless discharge of those thousand little offices of kindness and relief which we feel so deeply when we are ill, and forget so lightly when we are well, on whom could they make so deep an impression as on a young heart stored with every pure and true affection that women cherish, almost a stranger to the endearments and devotion of its own sex, save as it learnt them from itself, and rendered by calamity and suffering keenly susceptible of the sympathy so long unknown and so long sought in vain? What wonder that days became as years in knitting them together? What wonder if with every hour of returning health there came some stronger and sweeter recognition of the praises which Kate, when they recalled old scenes, they seemed old now as to have been acted years ago, would lavish on her brother? Where would have been the wonder, even, if those praises had found a quick response in the breast of Madeline, and if, with the image of Nicholas so constantly recurring in the features of his sister that she could scarcely separate the two, she had sometimes found it equally difficult to assign to each the feelings they had first inspired, and had imperceptibly mingled with her gratitude to Nicholas some of that warmer feeling which she had assigned to Kate. 'My dear,' Mrs. Nickleby would say, coming into the room with an elaborate caution, calculated to discompose the nerves of an invalid rather more than the entry of a horse soldier at full gallop, 'how do you find yourself tonight? I hope you are better.' 'Almost well, mama,' Kate would reply, laying down her work, and taking Madeline's hand in hers. 'Kate!' Mrs. Nickleby would say, reprovingly, 'don't talk so loud.' The worthy lady herself talking in a whisper that would have made the blood of the stoutest man run cold in his veins. Kate would take this reproof very quietly, and Mrs. Nickleby, making every board creak and every thread rustle as she moved stealthily about, would add, 'My son Nicholas has just come home, and I have come, according to custom, my dear, to know, from your own lips, exactly how you are, for he won't take my account, and never will.' 'He is later than usual tonight,' perhaps Madeline would reply, 'nearly half an hour.' 'Well, I never saw such people in all my life as you are, for time up here!' Mrs. Nickleby would exclaim in great astonishment. 'I declare I never did. I had not the least idea that Nicholas was after his time, not the smallest. Mr. Nickleby used to say, your poor papa I am speaking of, Kate my dear, used to say that appetite was the best clock in the world. But you have no appetite, my dear Miss Bray. I wish you had, and upon my word I really think you ought to take something that would give you one. I am sure I don't know, but I have heard that 2 or 3 dozen native lobsters give an appetite, though that comes to the same thing after all, for I suppose you must